Well, hello and welcome to this webinar on the IPCC Working Group 2 report of the 6th Assessment Report. My name is Richard Black. I'm a Senior Associate with the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit based in London, and many thanks to Climate Analytics for inviting me to host this webinar. As I'm sure many of you did, I spent a large chunk of the last 2 days looking at the report, and yeah, there's just an immense amount in there to unpack, as there always is. And we're going to be doing that today in the company of two of the chapter lead authors from Climate Analytics. We'll be hearing from Dr. Tabea Lissner, who is the lead author on the water chapter and also a drafting author on the summary for policymakers, and from Dr. Adele Thomas, who is a lead author on the key risks across sectors and regions chapter, and also a drafting author on the SPM. And we're going to be having reactions from two chairs of the various vulnerable groups, from Madeleine Diouf, SARR, who's the chair of the Least Developed Countries Group, the LDCs, and His Excellency Dr. Walton Webson, who's permanent representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the UN and current chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. I saw a quote from a scientist who wasn't connected with the report that really stood out to me, and his quote was simply, "If you want some good news, look away now." And you can see why, because there is lots in this report that is not good news at all. But it's not all like that. One of the things that I really liked in the report was it emphasized that there is agency. There is time to get things right on adaptation, and there are lessons about how to do this and how to do it as well as it possibly can be done. And we also saw the clearest call to arms that I've ever seen from the IPCC, which is quite remarkable. Okay, so this webinar is being recorded for posterity, and if at any time you have questions or comments, please type them in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, in the Q&A box. And after we've heard from our two lead authors and our two chairs of the vulnerable countries groups, then it'll be time for all of your questions and all of your comments to be addressed. Okay, so without any further ado, let me hand over to Dr. Adele Thomas and Dr. Tabea Lissner.
Thanks, Richard, and hello, everyone. We're very happy to be with you here today. Next slide, please. So before we get into the key messages that are coming from the reports, we just wanted to provide a brief background about the IPCC Working Group 2 and an overview of the scope of the report. So the IPCC has 3 different working groups, and Working Group 2 focuses on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability for both human and natural systems. Tabea and I are 2 of 270 authors that came from 67 different countries, and we've worked together over the past 4 years to produce this report. And you can see some of us in the picture there. We started this process out in South Africa, and we ended up working through the pandemic, figuring out, like many of you, how to collaborate via Zoom and Slack to get this done. It has been a very long and strenuous journey, but we are very pleased to share our findings. We don't conduct new research as the IPCC, but rather we assess existing research. And so for this report, we have assessed over 34,000 scientific papers to prepare our findings. During the process of writing the report, we received and considered and had to respond to over 62,000 comments from experts and governments from around the world. And this has really helped to make the report as comprehensive and as clear as possible. Next slide, please. So the report has 18 full chapters and 7 cross-chapter papers, along with an atlas. And so it really provides a wealth of information with thousands of pages. What we've done for you today is to pull out 7 key messages from the reports that we think are particularly relevant for vulnerable developing countries. And these key messages focus on the impacts of climate change that we are experiencing now, the risks that are projected as global temperatures increase, what we have found out about adaptation now and in the future, and the critical need for both mitigation and adaptation efforts to be ramped up now. And so I'll turn it over to Tabea to get us started on the first messages.
Thanks, Adele, and thank you all for joining. So yeah, I think one of the core things and core outputs that the report really underlines is that climate change is by no means a distant reality, but we're already facing today the effects or the impacts of global warming of around 1.1 degrees, and that has already caused dangerous and widespread impacts that have affected the lives of billions of people around the world. The consequent losses and damages that are caused by this increase in temperature really is seen in ecosystems, but has also affected people's lives and livelihoods as a consequence, for example, of increased weather extremes like floods and droughts, but also through the intensification of tropical cyclones, for example, rising sea levels, heavy rainfall events, and amongst others. What we see quite clearly is that across sectors and regions, the most vulnerable people and ecosystems are really observed to be disproportionately affected by these impacts and associated losses and damages. For the particular vulnerable regions, it's really a consequence out of overlapping challenges such as high levels of poverty, but also lack of access to funding, limited access to health, water, sanitation services, and also a high level of climate sensitive livelihoods that really lead to these disproportionate outcomes. One of the very important areas that really then touches on the very basic needs of people is really that water and food security have been affected by climate impacts already. So droughts, for example, but also other climate aspects have really led to an increase in food losses, which have led to situations of acute food insecurity and also malnutrition across different areas, especially in parts of Africa and Central and South America, with really a clearly increasing trend of these losses over the last decades. The next slide, please. What's also really clear in the report is that every increment of warming matters in terms of increasing risks. What's already clear is that we face several basically unavoidable climate hazards over the coming decades with global warming of up to 1.5 degrees. But it's also very clear that this is not a safe level of warming by no means. We're already today, we do see the negative consequences of climate change. And this further increase in warming will certainly result in higher impacts than what we experience now. And again, the level of risk in the end as an outcome is determined very strongly by vulnerability, but also exposure and the level of development and adaptation that is possible to ameliorate these risks. What we see is that risks are really highest for the especially sensitive system. Sorry, can you? Yeah, thank you. It's the risks are really highest for especially sensitive ecosystems and regions where temperatures are highest already today, but also for populations living across along coastlines and the frozen parts of the world. So really those areas that are dependent on glacier and snowmelt for their water security, for example. It is quite clear that even temporarily exceeding 1.5 degrees, so even for a short period of time, will result in additional impacts. Some of those may be reversible when temperatures decrease again to below that level, but some of those, like for example, sea level rise, are irreversible in the sense that they will remain for a long amount of time. So it's very clear that near-term action to limit global warming to as close to 1.5 degrees as possible substantially reduces the risks and losses and damages that are associated with increasing warming for human systems and ecosystems. Next slide, please. What we have seen very clearly, though, is that awareness of climate change has led to an increase in adaptation action. Quite a lot of that is focused on planning, and we do see rather limited implementation, but certainly action overall has increased. What we do see, unfortunately, though, is that it's unevenly distributed, and the speed of current adaptation is not enough to really face the challenges that we already have today. So there's a gap that's observed between the adaptation action and what would be needed to face climate risk that we see today and those that are projected in the near future. The largest gaps in adaptation are really seen among lower income population groups. And that is already also one aspect that we really see, that financial constraints are very important in limiting adaptation options, are an important aspect of overcoming some of these limitations. So the current global financial flows are insufficient to meet the adaptation challenge, especially in developing countries. And what we also see is that the overwhelming majority of climate finance overall that we see is directed towards mitigation, and only a small portion of it is actually targeted to adaptation action. Next slide, please. The report shows quite clearly that there are adaptation options that are feasible to implement and that can also be effective in reducing climate risk. But as I mentioned in the previous slide, the overall scope of adaptation currently is not sufficient. What we also see is that the options that we're aware of at this point are becoming less effective with increasing warming. One of the most important sectors that where we see a lot of adaptation action happening is related to water, both in terms of responding to water-related hazards like droughts and floods, but also in terms of ensuring adequate access to water and water management. There are quite a lot of effective and feasible options that have been documented there. But in terms of their effectiveness at higher levels of warming, we really see that above 1.5 degrees, the effectiveness of all of the options that we do have projections on decreases, and the residual impacts or the residual risks after adaptation increase. And a similar picture also evolves for ecosystem-based adaptation that really depend on healthy ecosystems, where a lot of those will lose their effectiveness in providing their benefits to people in terms of adaptation above 1.5 degrees, when ecosystems become increasingly affected and reach limits to their adaptive capacity. And with that, I will hand over to Adele for some further insights on adaptation. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Next slide, please. The next key message that we have is that limits to adaptation have already been reached. We are already finding that while some people and some places are adapting, which Tabea covered for us, this adaptation is simply not enough to prevent significant negative impacts. We do differentiate between soft and hard limits. So soft limits can be overcome if additional adaptation takes place. You may be at a soft limit now, but there are still things that you can do. However, you don't currently have the ability or the resources to do them now. Soft limits are reached mostly due to constraints, and constraints are things which make it harder to plan or implement adaptation. If you can deal with the constraints, then you can overcome a soft limit. So we're seeing that we are at soft limits now. The most pressing constraints that are leading to these soft limits are lack of finance and the need for stronger governance, institutions, and policies for adaptation. For some developing countries, such as small islands, you can see in the figure there that they face multiple constraints at very high levels. And so this is leading to soft limits to adaptation being experienced now. We differentiate hard limits, which is when there are simply no other adaptation measures that are possible. And we are seeing hard limits in natural systems now. So some ecosystems are already reaching hard limits, and these include some coral reefs and some coastal wetlands. And this is resulting in permanent loss. As we increase warming, it's projected that it will become even more difficult to adapt. And so we will see additional human and natural systems that will reach these limits to adaptation. Above 1.5 degrees means that a lack of fresh water could result in people living on small islands and those dependent on glaciers and snow melts reaching limits to adaptation. And by 2 degrees, it may be especially challenging to farm multiple staple crops in current growing areas, particularly in tropical regions where we find many vulnerable and developing countries. So we have increasing evidence that limits to adaptation are a growing concern. Next slide, please. This is related to the next key message, which is that adaptation cannot prevent all losses and damages. And so we're quite pleased to provide an assessment of losses and damages, which are the negative impacts and risks of climate change. We find that losses and damages are inevitable. We will continue to experience negative impacts of climate change despite adaptation. Adaptation is simply not enough. It can reduce some of these negative impacts, but it cannot eliminate them. We also find that losses and damages are concentrated among the poorest and most vulnerable populations, such as migrant communities, low-income households, and other marginalized groups. We have assessed that current financial, governance, and institutional arrangements are simply not enough to address losses and damages now or in the future. And this is particularly the case in vulnerable developing countries. Next slide, please. And this brings us to our final message, which is that mitigation and adaptation is needed now. And this is much more urgent than we previously assessed. The next 10 years are really critical. The report stresses the need for climate resilient development, and this brings together both mitigation and adaptation along with sustainable development. So we simultaneously need to mitigate to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. We need to adapt to reduce the risks of climate change. And we also need to address losses and damages that will continue. Achieving climate resilient development is already quite difficult, even with current levels of warming, but this will become even more difficult as warming increases. If we hit 2 degrees of warming, then climate resilient development may not be possible for particularly vulnerable regions, such as small islands, deserts, mountains, and polar regions. And this is where we find a lot of our vulnerable developing countries. And so this all underscores the importance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees for developing countries in particular, and ramping up adaptation significantly. And with that, I'll just hand it back to Tabea to wrap us up.
Thank you, Adele. So yeah, I mean, to maybe one of the statements that best summarizes really the report, even though Richard did a very good job in the beginning as well in saying, if you want good news, maybe the report is not the ideal place to go, where we do see that climate change is already a threat to human well-being and the well-being of the planet and the ecosystems that we depend on. But it's really also a call to action where we do see that urgent climate action is essential to limit impacts and also to ensure adaptation remains possible. And we do have a time-limited window for action to ensure that we are able to continue to operate or to ensure climate resilient development, to ensure a livable future for all. So with that, I thank you all for attending, and we really hope that the summary of key messages has given you a good insight into the report, and looking forward to questions and answers. Thanks.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Tabea and Adele. Wonderful job of condensing 4 years of work into about 15 minutes. Incredible. Okay, so we're going to get some reactions now immediately from the chairs of 2 of the major developing country groups. Just before we go to the first of those, just let me remind you, if you've got comments or questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. We've got 3 in there now, and after we've heard from the 2 chairs, we're going to get through as many of those as we can, so get typing. Okay, without further ado, let me pass over to His Excellency Dr. Walton Webson, who is the permanent representative of Antigua and Barbuda to the UN in New York, and currently the chair of the Alliance of Small Island States. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. You can hear me clearly?
Very well, thank you.
Thanks. Great. Thanks. Thank you very much. And I first of all want to thank you for on this webinar, and thanks to the presenters, especially to our good Islander friend, Dr. Thomas. Always important to hear you and learn from you, and to, I hope other people would be listening to the warning. Colleagues, friends, as you know, Antigua and Barbuda is the current chair, as was just said by the chairman of the Alliance of Small Island States, and a membership body of small islands throughout the United Nations. AOSIS have been shaken by the core. It's really an understatement for me to even say that, by the scientific findings coming out of this, this working group 2 report of the IPCC. Friends, I fear, we have been saying this, previous chairs of AOSIS have been saying this for decades. When I listen to the presenters just now, I know we have heard some of this before, but it sounds like we're getting to D-Day. Yet, we are continuing headwards at a breakneck speed towards the cliff edge of what seems like an accelerated pace. It seems like we're heading faster than ever. We are not seeing the required action from major emitters to get emissions down in this critical decade. Small islands will not be able to develop or adapt beyond if we go beyond 1.5 Celsius. We've said that. Last year, the IPCC told us that sea level was already rising by something like 20 centimeters and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future, for thousands of years to come. This year, we are learning that there are some catastrophic impacts that will irrevocably, even if, that is irrevocable, even if we just transcendently overshoot our targets. The science cannot be any clearer. Small island developing states are already disproportionately experiencing climate impacts. We see it every year. What are major economies waiting for? How much more do we need to talk? Impacts are only projected to get worse. More must be done, and it must be done now. More must be done on adaptation and on building resilience to keep pace with these impacts. Loss and damage is occurring and will continue to occur. Major emitters need to realize that this issue will not go away with every year that passes by. Every year that we delay the reducing of emissions, more is lost. Colleagues, finance is mentioned many times, multiple times in the IPCC report, both as a key barrier and a necessity for successful adaptation measures. But we knew this, we spoke of this. In COP26, we took a step in the right direction, committing to doubling of adaptation finance. But this needs to be the floor, not the ceiling. AOSIS calls on our partners to not waste time in putting the mandate from COP26 into action. We ask that by COP27, our developed country partners come to the table with a clear standalone plan on how they will deliver on this commitment. The G7 and G20 must do more to reduce their emissions as quickly as possible. The solutions are with us, they're there. But we need to see more than just nice words and rhetoric. We need to see reduction in line with what the science is telling us. We need to see action. Finally, colleagues, it is clear that time is slipping away. Time is not with us, which is why Antigua and Barbuda, as chair of AOSIS, will make a strong effort within the General Assembly of the United Nations to bring an emergency meeting or some high-level meeting to address the catastrophic cosmic plane we are falling towards, which is discussed in the IPCC 6th assessment report. We must take action, and we must do it now. This is no joke. For our member states, it is, and we demand an adequate response, and we demand that response now. We cannot wait. We appeal to all who are hearing us to work with us to take action, not words. I thank you.
Ambassador Webson, many thanks for joining us on what is undoubtedly a massively busy time at UN headquarters in New York, and thank you for that clarion call as well. For some further thoughts, from further reactions to what you've been hearing, let me pass over now, if I may, to Madeleine Diouf, who's head of the Climate Change Division in Senegal's Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development and chair of the Least Developed Countries Group. Over to you.
Thank you, Richard, and greeting from Senegal. I want also to join my thanks to presenter who have made a great expose of report coming from the IPCC, from the working group too. When I read this report, I see it's a great deal of fear and sadness, but we were not surprised. And you know that the least developing country used to recall the necessity to acknowledge information coming from the IPCC and all scientific regarding the increase of the global warming. And we can use what's happening in the few weeks ago with Cyclone Basira, who has devastated Madagascar, killing hundreds of people and displacing of over 10,000 of the population from Madagascar. Climate change is affecting the life experiences of millions of people across the world today. Our relationship with nature define our humanities is really central. At the heart of my reading of this report is the importance of 1.5 limit. So much depends on our ability to act in the near term to curb emission. A vulnerable country like those that I represent cannot adapt to compensate from delay from large emitter. Often the discussion on adaptation is framed around a moral obligation. Climate change is an issue occur with inequity. Developing countries should not bear the burden of having to adapt to a climate manipulated by the emission of major fuel emitter countries. But now we see that we cannot bear that burden. Vulnerable countries like this developing country are already reaching limit of what they can do on adaptation. And we are only at 1.1 degrees Celsius. There is no path to sustainable development for us beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the report and the presentation we do have show that. Even temporarily stepping beyond the threshold will lead to the loss of the entire ecosystem and food and water shortage. While we could then be able to reduce mean temperature to below this limit, some of these consequences will not be reversible. And because the loss of biodiversity is here, the loss of human is also here. We must pursue both mitigation and adaptation and speed more, scale beyond what we have seen before. Finance is a key barrier for adaptation. I point to the multiple references in the report that emphasize the need for dedicated and accessible finance for successful adaptation measures. Here we know we must and can do more. We saw additional finance promised at Glasgow, but we all know this will not be enough. The pandemic and climate change have negatively impacted our economy and our financial option when it comes to investing in long-term solutions for sustainable development. The amount of finance, access, adequacy, and quality of funding are critical issues but require dedicated space in the international negotiation. On loss and damage, this report acknowledges that there is no formal definition of loss and damage in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. But it comes to talking on action on this issue. We must act. It will get worse and more people will suffer if with every increment of warming. We have been talking about loss and damage for a long time. Now it's time to see a tangible result on institutional arrangement, on loss and damage, and also action. We need to see additional and substantial finance made available to vulnerable countries who are watching their agriculture land disappear, their water source dry up, and their crop fail. It is a vicious and infernal cycle. We have a window, a very limited one, but it does exist. In Glasgow, all countries agree we will revisit our 2030 target this year in an effort to bridge the gap between where we are and where we need to be to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. This is an acceleration of what was agreed in Paris. We acknowledge that there is no time to waste, not a year to spare in this critical decade. Even though we contribute less to the cause, 45 out of LDCs have stepped ahead to raise ambition by submitting new and updated NDCs. It is time for all of us, especially the G20 nations, to deliver on this promise. No one will escape the impact of climate crisis. However, as been shown, the poorest and most vulnerable are already facing experiences, existences, consequences. It is my life who is actually concerned. The IPCC report is a dire reminder of the need to rapid action to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius and to support countries experiencing the impact of climate change. I thank you for the opportunities.
Lovely, thank you so much. And I believe you're staying with us for the discussion, Mrs. SARR, as well. So we can come back to you with some questions as well. Excellent, thank you very much. Let's start with loss and damage, if we may. And Nusrat Chowdhury posed a question, which I think may have been on the minds of many people who are reading this and comparing it with what is talked about in the United Nations climate process. There we talk about loss and damage. Here we talk about losses and damages. Perhaps, Tabea, would you be able to unpick this a little bit for us? Why are we seeing this phrase here and loss and damage in the UN climate negotiations, and how do the two things relate together?
I would actually defer this question to Adele, who is definitely much more the expert on loss and damage than I am.
Okay, Adele, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And it's a really good question. So we report on losses and damages, and we specifically define these as the negative impacts and risks of climate change. And by using this term losses and damages, we're able to draw from a wide range of literature. So there's scientific literature which uses the term loss and damage. There's also scientific literature that speaks about losses or economic losses. And there's scientific literature that only talks about damages. And so by using this losses and damages, we're able to capture and report on all of that literature. And so we have a much more, I think, extensive report that reflects negative impacts that are being experienced now and which are projected to increase. And we hope that the way that we have reported on this is helpful for the UNFCCC without being policy prescriptive. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And let me follow up perhaps to you, Madeleine Diouf SARR, if I may. We have another question on loss and damage from Colin McQuiston, who asks whether the commitment made at COP26 to establish the Santiago network will be enough to change pace on loss and damage. Is it sufficient on its own? If not, what else needs to be done?
Yes, thank you for this question. I think the outcome we do have from Glasgow regarding the issue on loss and damage, establishing a Santiago network is a first step for having something concrete concrete on loss and damage. We need also to look at the governance of loss and damage, and I think the process also will go on with the governance process discussion. So we do think that Santiago network will allow to share experiences, will allow to move to action, concrete action. And we're going to build on the experiences faced by, I can say it's bad experiences faced by different countries who have been affected by extreme events, to see how we can maybe propose to the international communities way to come up with a concrete process on loss and damage. And I think it's a starting point, and I am sure that we all, with this report coming from the IPCC, be sure that information is available really to bring out on a concrete outcome during the Sharm el-Sheikh next COP who is coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Adele, would you have anything to add on that question?
I think that what we have in the report on current financial and governance and institutional mechanisms that are insufficient, I think that provides our assessment of what's out there now. And again, we're not able to be policy prescriptive.
Great, thanks. Tabea, maybe I'll come to you for what was the first question to come up, actually, and it's a disarmingly simple question with probably quite a complex answer, which is really, what countries are we talking about as being most at risk from climate impacts, most in need of adaptation assistance? And I guess this also goes to the question, which I think came out very clearly in this report, about underlying vulnerability being really, really key here.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And indeed, it's a very important and short question, but of course, yeah, has many different strands to answer on. Maybe to start with, the report as such focuses on kind of globally, on a global aggregation, if you will, of the literature that is available. As Adele indicated in the outset, we assessed a huge number of papers, and aggregate those kind of for more regionally valid findings to really understand what's relevant globally. So the key outputs that we mainly focused on today are really those that are also represented in the summary for policymakers, and really that a focus there in a lot of cases is to really provide those overarching statements that are extremely robust in terms of the science that goes into this. What we see clearly, I guess, coming out of the report is that, of course, the kind of the climate change drivers, so the actual change that we see out of climate is very different in different regions. So really the actual issue of climate change is very different for different regions, but the socioeconomic setup, so the vulnerability and exposure really very strongly across regions. And it's always very hard to just compare regions, because a lot of it is also about marginalized population groups that we do have in all regions of the world that are especially affected.
And there's another question while we're on this point, Tabea, that's come in from Adama Faye. One of the most striking phrases, I think, when talking about drivers of vulnerability was the mention of the word colonialism. And so Adama Faye asks, when the IPCC says that marginalization, historical and ongoing patterns of inequity, such as colonialism and governance, are drivers of vulnerability, are there any particular countries here, particular geographic areas, or is it, as you were saying then, that in most regions of the world you can find examples of this?
I think in this case, really, with this very overarching statement, it is indeed the case that this is a finding that holds across regions of the world. Even though, of course, then the specific setting of where those findings are actually documented in the literature, would have very specific examples for the regions where we see this. But it is a huge report, and I must admit that I haven't read every single sentence of it, so I wouldn't be able to provide examples now. But certainly, what we find in terms of those kind of almost global statements that really summarize the facts is always based in very detailed assessments that really build up those lines of arguments.
Lovely, thanks very much. Now, one of these phrases that that sometimes crops up in a rather sober language in reports like this can actually have a very profound meaning, and I was struck by a lot of the language here, in particular that last phrase in the report. Basically, any further delay will miss a window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. And Gerrit Hansen asks, what exactly is meant by a livable future in this context? Adele, could you give us a few thoughts on that one?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And what we're finding is that even now, some people's current circumstances are not livable, with the impacts that we're seeing, with the deaths that we're seeing, that all can be attributed to climate change. If we don't have a livable current, And so this is why, the findings on climate resilient development are so important. It says that climate resilient development brings together adaptation, mitigation, and also sustainable development. So it's achieving those sustainable development goals, improving people's well-being, reducing poverty and hunger, improving health and livelihoods, providing people with clean energy and water. And the findings are quite clear that we don't have that now, but that we do need to have that. And that's why, it's so important to have adaptation, mitigation along together with achieving those sustainable development goals. Thanks.
I wanted to ask you actually, if I can use Chair's prerogative for a moment, about that last statement. And what struck me about it, the cumulative scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human being, well-being and planetary health. Any further delay basically in getting on with it will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. What struck me about this is that every government signs off the IPCC report, right? So unless I missed something about the procedure, every government in the world has now put its name to that statement. That seems to me quite something that we should mark, Adele.
Yeah, it's a huge statement. And, I think this is a really strong SPM with lots of really strong messages that what we're doing now is not enough and that we need to do much more and we need to do it now. I think for a long time, the focus has been on mitigation, which is incredibly important in order to keep, to that 1.5 limit. But what we are putting forward in this working group too is that at the same time, we need urgent action on adaptation. Current adaptation is simply not cutting it. And we also need to achieve sustainable development goals. So it's all of it together that needs to happen now. And we're quite clear on that. And we hope that this is then picked up in policy and action.
Yes, and there was some really interesting language, I thought, there in the report about the need for sort of transformative adaptation, looking forward, spending the big money now on addressing the underlying causes of vulnerability, as well as the precise impact that you're trying to protect against. It was very interesting. Well, let's stick with financing and adaptation now. And a question for you, Madeleine Diouf from Camberi Cox, who says that you mentioned in your intervention, you mentioned challenges accessing climate finance in the middle of the pandemic and the other issues around the world. And could you share what strategies have worked in negotiating cabinet budgets to accommodate climate smart infrastructure and mitigation measures? That's from Camberi Cox in Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you for a great question. Yes, I think we all know that developing country, in particular least developing country, are really having big challenges to respond to the adaptation need, and also to do some action on mitigation part, but they are really engaged on that. We as been mentioned, we have one who are less contributing to the status of the climate change. Actually, our emission is really low. If I take the case of Africa, it's less than 4% of the emission occurring in the atmosphere. So, and we facing a lot of impact from climate change. I think the loss of land that was really been accessed by the IPCC show that, and we know that that impact for food security. We also facing a lot of flood and sea elevation rise, sea rise. And we know that a lot of infrastructure also are lost due to that. And we have, I think, in a lot of evidence on all these least developing countries on the clear impact of climate change. But if you look at the budget of this least developing country, they already have to take on board the the small need of a population and the communities. And if you take actually what we're facing, the COVID impact is something also that coming up in they need to solve a health problem for the communities. And climate change is additional, so it's really difficult for these countries to maintain a certain level of sustainability. So yes, it's why I think the point of finance is really critical, and we have to really maybe move on concrete action. Yes, there is some support, but we all know that this support is totally insufficient regarding to the need for all these least developing countries and of those vulnerable countries like small islands. So I think this report will be helpful for the discussion around doubling the adaptation finance. It will be really useful also on the necessity to revise the quantified financial resources necessary to combat climate change and also to solve the consequences coming from climate hazard.
Great, thank you so much. Adele, just staying with climate finance a minute, you're obviously very familiar with the situation of small island developing states, and Sophia Dujon asked very simply what kinds of adaptation finance would be most helpful for small island developing states.
Sure. So in the report, we do an assessment of climate finance specifically for small islands. And we find that a lot of the climate finance is coming in the form of loans, which are not helpful. So there is a need, for more grants-based finance. And in addition to that, there's a need for longer term finance. So you may get an initial, project finance to put in a seawall or to do some type of adaptation measure. You do that project. Once it's completed, there's no money to upkeep it. The project ends up, not being able to prevent flooding or whatever, and then you're back at square one. So there's a need for more grant finance and also for more long-term program adaptation funding. Thanks.
Thanks, Adele. And there's another interesting question here on financing for adaptation from Lowell Darlett, and Tabea, perhaps I could address that to you. If we're talking about financing for adaptation, doesn't that in a sense give license to the financer, which in most cases would be a Western government, to pursue an economy that further contributes to climate change?
Thanks. Yeah, also an excellent question, and it's it's long been a discussion in the adaptation space that we do need to focus on mitigation in order for that exactly not to happen. And I think the report is really strong around the fact that adaptation is not an alternative. It's already something that we urgently need now with the climate impacts that we face. And we urgently need to step up the game on mitigation as well, and reducing emissions and limiting warming in order for adaptation to still be able to ensure that we can cope with the risks that we face. As we do see that the range of options that we were able to assess in terms of how effective they will be in the future, that they lose their effectiveness. So it simply it will become increasingly difficult. And for a range of systems, both for ecosystems, it's a lot more direct, I guess, to assess in terms of what we see in terms of limits to their adaptive capacity to deal with increasing temperatures and changes, but also for human systems, it will become increasingly difficult with limits being reached. So certainly, I think we do have very strong messaging around this, and I suppose it's a related point, even though somewhat different, is that in addition, adaptation needs to be planned in a way that does not increase emissions either, so that we really do focus on an integrated pathway towards climate resilient development that really thinks those points in conjunction, where they're not exclusive pathways, but where we really do invest in mitigation and adaptation and sustainable development for this to become a sustainable future.
Yes, that was another interesting part of the summary for policymakers, I thought, was the section on maladaptation, basically doing it in a comprehensive way, not creating extra problems as that's happening. One other question that's coming out on limits to adaptation is quite an interesting one from Musa Na Abu Mahmouda, who talks about, okay, we've talked about soft limits and hard limits. I think, Adele, that was you, wasn't it? You did that bit of the presentation, didn't you? So perhaps I can come to you with this question. Shall we fear psychological limits where vulnerable countries may lose the hope to adapt?
That is a great question, and one that I have grappled with as well. We do account for psychological factors as a constraint. So this would be something that would make it harder to plan or implement adaptation if you feel like, what's the point, right? So we do account for that underneath constraints that will come under social and cultural constraints. We do hope that with this report, we provide not only the evidence of what's happening now and what could happen, which is quite sobering, but we do show, we still have a chance to make a difference. And so we hope that this, provides some hope that there's still something that can be done, and the urgency with which we need to do that. Thanks.
We're just a few minutes away from the end of the webinar, but I'd like to squeeze in a couple more questions if I can. So here's one, I think, for Madeleine Diouf SARR, if you would, from Colin McQuestion again. So we have in Paris Agreement and the Climate Convention, we have sort of indicators. We have indicators for mitigation. We have indicators for adaptation. Do we need an indicator on loss and damage? Should we be looking, he suggests, as a reduction in global loss and damage as an indicator of progress?
Thank you. Yes, we have an indicator regarding mitigation. So we know how much we have to reduce the emission for the 1.5 and even for the 2 degree. So this is well known. For adaptation, we're still working on the global goal for adaptation. So as we know, that adaptation is also a dynamic, depending where the temperature is. So we have really to adapt and avoid any irreversible situation. And now we know that 1.5 is critical threshold of temperature we have all to work on. Regarding the loss and damage, I think we might need a lot of simulation coming from the experts in order to see, depending on where we're gonna be with 1.5, what are the risk of the level of loss and damage we're gonna face in the different regions of the world. I think this is important. And this will, I think we need this kind of assessment. So I don't know if experts who are here can give us more thought on that, because we know that even if we try to reduce the temperature and raise the 1.5 degree, we're going to continue having this loss. So the issue is how are we going to organize at the international level in order really to secure enough source of funding or enough financial resource in order really to minimize those loss and damage. I think this is something that is important. I think also the level of adaptation we can have will also help us a lot to reduce the loss and damage. So these are the kind of, I think, thought I have on my view. We need really to have action for adaptation. And the level of action for adaptation we're going to have will limit the loss and damage. But also regarding where we're going to be, we have to assess the risk of loss in the world and try to organize at a level that we can minimize the loss and the damage.
Great, thank you so much. I think there's no doubt that we're going to be hearing a lot more about this kind of question during the year ahead, because I think partly because of this report, the pressure to have loss and damage as a kind of equal third pillar alongside adaptation and mitigation in the convention process and the Paris process is only going to increase this year. So we're going to wrap up there. There's much more we could have talked about. To those of you whose questions we didn't get around to, I do apologise, but I think there'll be many more opportunities to talk about this this kind of thing over the coming year. So thanks to our four speakers, His Excellency Walton Webson, who's very busy at UN headquarters today, and Madeleine Diouf, SARR, Chair of the LDCs from Senegal, our two experts from climate analytics and IPCC lead authors, Dr. Tabea Lissner and Dr. Adele Thomas. And many thanks to you for all joining, and thanks to Climate Analytics for organising that. And with that, I wish you a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world.